Whoa, that's louder than expected. Sorry. I was told to speak very loudly into the microphone. So, welcome everyone. I think we still have a few people coming past, but we'll get started in just a minute. I think if it's difficult to hear at the back, there is a little bit of space still at the front. So if you want to move up to the front so I don't scream at the people in the front. Ready? Yeah. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this panel on the German elections. As you all know, or as you should all know, the German federal elections took place on September 26th, 2021. And now, for the first time in almost 16 years, Germany is going to have a new chancellor. And 16 years is a long time. Most of you are probably of the Merkel generation. Most students probably don't have a conscious memory of Germany being led by someone other than Angela Merkel. So I'm very excited that we have this great panel of experts to help us make sense of what a new government in Germany might look like and what implications a new government and a new chancellor will have for Europe and also for the rest of the world. So our panel consists of the distinguished Herr Botschafter, Ambassador Brengelmann. He served as the ambassador to the Netherlands from 2016 to 2021. And before that, he was NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Security Policy, and he also served as political counselor at the German Embassy in London, Deputy European Correspondent in the Federal Foreign Office, and political counselor at the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. So a great career, great expert, and we thank you for being here today. Our second panel, our guest is Professor Bert Koenders, who served as the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2014 to 2017, and previously, amongst many other important jobs, also worked as the Minister for Development Cooperation, and in those two capacities, worked quite closely with the German government, I'm sure, as well. He's now Professor of Peace, Justice, and Security here at Leiden University, and thanks for being here. And then our last expert is Professor Joachim Koops, who is the Scientific Director of the Institute for Security and Global Affairs, as well as Professor for Security Studies. His research focuses on global security governance and the European Union's foreign and security policy, and as a German himself, will, I'm sure, also have some expertise to share with us. So thank you for being here. We have about an hour and a half, including Q&A. So for the next 45 minutes, we will discuss with the panel what the elections look like, what the results look like, what it means for Germany moving forward. And then we'll also talk a little bit about what implications it has for the rest of the world. So, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience afterwards. So for those following online, you can also send your questions in, and I'll try and keep an eye on them over here. And in the audience, we'll welcome some input from you as well. So to kick off, Dr. Koops, can you give us a brief overview of the election results and what happens now in terms of forming a government, especially as we have breaking news already today? So maybe for the students in the audience and for the rest of us, can you just give us an overview of what the election results were like and what kind of coalitions there are possible now?
Sure. Thanks very much, Eva. I hope you can hear me also at the back. Oh, even closer. There we go. All right. Thank you so much for the introductions, and thanks to everyone for coming on a Friday afternoon. It's a great turnout, and great to see also interest in the implications of Germany's elections here at the university. So, as you probably undoubtedly are aware of, the results were remarkable in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. First of all, as Eva referred to, the leading party of Angela Merkel lost the elections, and quite by a far margin if you compare it to all the previous results of the previous years. It was not led, of course, the campaign by Angela Merkel herself, but by her, hopeful successor, Armin Laschet, and we can also go into some of the details on the role that personalities and individual choices played. Also a trend we see, of course, across Europe, but also in Germany, where normally, traditionally, party affiliation matters, but increasingly also personalities and individuals make a difference. The second surprise is that the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which, again, a European trend for the last 10 to 15 years, the decline of social democratic parties has come out top in the elections, only a little bit above 1% ahead, but nevertheless ahead. And then the third surprising showing was of the two smaller parties, the Liberals, the FDP, and the Greens, both of them taking 11.5% of the vote in the case of the Liberals and 14.8% in terms of the Greens. For the Greens, it was a little bit of a bittersweet victory. On the one hand, it's the strongest result in their history, in their party history since 1990 when they were founded. But it looked like in May and June that they could even beat the other big parties and could even win the elections and provide the first Green Chancellor. So in that sense, and there was also a variety of mistakes made maybe by the party and the front runner, a loss of 8 to 9% at the end of the campaign meant that they come up third, but very strong third. Now, what does it mean for the coalitions? Germany normally, traditionally, is either ruled by a single party or by coalitions of two parties. In the previous years, we saw the so-called Grand Coalition, so the two biggest parties, CDU, the Conservatives, and SPD, the Social Democrats, had a Grand Coalition, interrupted once by a coalition between the CDU, the Conservatives, and the Liberals. So we now see, not for the first time, because the first ever government of the Federal Republic in 1949 also had a three-party coalition. But since then, it was mostly either a single-party coalition or a grand coalition. So the first time we see now what some people in Germany call maybe a move towards Dutch conditions, where we have more and more smaller parties. We're quite far away from that yet in Germany, but still the fact that the next government will be based on a three-party coalition is remarkable in itself. What is also remarkable is that it's not the biggest party or the election winner that dominated now the headlines and the future shape of the government, but it's really the two smaller parties that are where the tail is wagging the dog, so to say. It's the Greens and the Liberals that are really dominating right now coalition formation discussions. Just today at 1 o'clock, in time for our panel, so, thanks, Bert and Ambassador, for influencing the German media to make sure that they release this before this event. The three parties announced that after initial talks, they will now recommend to their parties to go into a coalition negotiations. So in all likelihood, a so-called traffic light coalition between the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals will emerge. There are huge differences on a variety of topics still when we think about the role of investments, debt versus innovation, how investments should be made to tackle climate change, and on various of issues. Normally, the Liberals and the Greens are seen as competitors rather than partners. But there's been a lot of time invested into trying to find commonalities rather than differences. And the final aspect I want to highlight for the results is we see also a generation difference in terms of how voters voted. So particularly those that voted for the first time in the age group 18 to 24, the majority vote of this group went to the Liberals and the Greens. So 23% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted for the Greens, and 21% for the Liberals. The inverse picture in terms of the voters above 70, where between 8 to 7% of those voters opted for the Greens and Liberals. And you see exactly the mirror image for the big parties. So for the SPD and CDU, the smallest votes came from the group of 18 to 24-year-olds, and the highest share for those above 70 or older. So you see also in the preference of the votes a kind of generational difference in their preferences. So Liberals and Greens really, in a sense, have the legitimacy of the youth vote in that sense. And that also translates into preferences. So a variety of surveys asked voters, which party do you think is most capable of governing Germany? And the results were there that 28% said it should be the Social Democrats that are most competent to solve current German issues, 26% the Conservatives, and the Greens 10%. But if you look at the question, which party is best placed to solve Germany's future problems, it's the inverse. So you see the Greens 20%, the Social Democrats 18%, and the Conservatives 14%. So what does that mean? It means the party of competence for immediate concerns are still the big two parties, Conservatives and Social Democrats. Those that, if you ask about the future, and here of course climate change is a key issue, we come back to probably, it's really for the two smaller groups, parties of the Greens and the Liberals. So there are a variety of interesting implications. And in the last point, voters were asked what was the most important topic for you. Today, of course, we discuss implications in foreign and security policy. And as always, any spectator of German elections was probably frustrated how little Europe or foreign policy is featured. But that's, I think, a normal case for any election most of the time. Voters are not per se particularly interested in foreign policy. And that's also reflected in the question on what issue was most important for you. And their social security, so your immediate economic security was the highest, 28%. Climate change, 22%. Work or the economy, 22%. And how the government handled Corona, which many people predicted would be a key factor, only 7%. So the immediate economic issue and climate change across the board are the most important issues. Foreign policy not even on the chart in terms of percentage. So this gives you some kind of context on the results of the elections.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Brengelmann, could you perhaps reflect on the election results from your own perspective a little bit as well, and maybe touch in your answer on what it means for the German political landscape? Will we see continuity? Will we see change? And what might that look like?
Yeah, thank you. And it sounds like a dream for a former ambassador to be able to decide on the timing of a press conference in Berlin. But believe me, that didn't play a role at all. We haven't seen a revolution in Germany. It was mainly a redistribution of votes between the middle ground parties. So we haven't also seen what sometimes people would refer to as a clear-cut polarization. The left and the right overall didn't win, they actually lost. But, and that's an important but, the right-wing party was able to gain a lot of votes in two of the German states. So in that sense, we have had a bit of a regional polarization, but not overall. As I just said, it was a redistribution of the votes in the middle, so to say. But as the professor just said, there's an interesting feature, because the younger generation was voting mainly the Greens and the Liberals. It would mean, if that continues to be the case, that in the long run, the so-called Volksparteien, the old parties, CDU and SPD, would rather come down even more, whereas the Greens and the Liberals would move up. So what we might see is perhaps not a fragmentation, so in that sense, no comparison with the Dutch system, but perhaps a little bit of a Nivellierung, as we say in German. They kind of level out. And as also the professor just said, the two parties, the Greens and the Liberals, were able to capture, so to say, the future. The Liberals had a slogan which was, as it is now, it can't remain. Clearly, the Greens said we have to change things when it comes to climate. And many people saw a lot of campaign, Fridays for Future, etc., for climate issues. And it was a bit of a surprise to see that with the younger voters, that would be an even vote for the Liberals and the Greens. Nobody really had expected that outcome. So that is an interesting feature, so to say, for the future. Again, we haven't seen a revolution, but we have seen a shift. Before, with the CDU, it was a little more on the conservative side. Now it will be more social democratic and, as Professor just indicated, with a very strong flavor of the Liberals and the Greens. And you can see that in the paper which has been distributed today, when they decided that they will now start formal negotiations, because what they have done until now was informal. So they will now go into formal negotiations, and the issue is modernization. The key slogan is Aufbruch, which means break from the past, prepare the future.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Koenders, could you also reflect on the election results, perhaps from your perspective from the Netherlands a little bit, and widen, broaden the scope to the rest of Europe? What do you think this change or continuity might mean also for upcoming European elections, especially in France and Italy?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the colleagues. I'm the only non-German here in front of you, so I have to be very careful because the knowledge is really on my right and on my left. But there is no doubt about it for me as a Dutch politician and now in academia, but I think it's for many countries in the world that it's absolutely key for us what happens in Germany. And that these elections were therefore absolutely crucial also for the rest of Europe. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I have not much to add to the excellent analyses that have been made by my colleagues. I think this has been definitely a choice in Germany for what you could call cautious change. And that change was very much embodied by the young generation. I wanted to say something more about it, but I think Joachim and the ambassadors mentioned it. I think it was fascinating to see that the former people's parties, especially the SPD and the CDU, were not very popular among the young, even in different classes of the young in Germany. And that you saw especially the FDP working with a younger generation who want a more modern economy, less bureaucratic, more in the direction of real digital change. I think that was really their platform. And on the Greens, I think it's fascinating. If you look to Europe, you asked me that, and I looked at the Eurobarometer. You see that by far the country of Germany is the one where the voters find the environment the most important. Of course, it's everywhere. It's also in this country, it's in France, it's in Italy. But if you look, what do you put first? Compared to other countries, it's in relative terms incredibly important. And I see on the platform today that probably the sort of more liberal side of this new coalition, if it's going to happen, is going to really foster the idea of, make sure that the German economy becomes more vivid, more competitive, more modern, and really makes the structural changes in the direction of a green economy. And obviously the Greens have given there the leadership. And I see the advantage now being in Germany that there is quite a bit of money, that in terms of the issue of taxes and the investment agenda is actually a little bit, you could say, the FDP versus the Greens, that they can solve that because there is enough money. You don't immediately have to go to higher taxes, what the Liberals don't want, to finance an investment agenda. That brings me a little bit to the momentum. I think this momentum of cautious change is specific to Germany, but not necessarily only the case in Germany. I see it in this country and elsewhere. I think with the great respect that I have personally, and she's not from my party, for Chancellor Merkel as a moral leader, pragmatist, extremely intelligent, who've worked also on consensus in Europe, that at the same time this campaign was also showing that in terms of succession in her party, that was not very well done, and it's a problem in any party, by the way. Succession problems are always there, and you see that the CDU more lost than the SPD won. But there is a more structural side to this. I think we're in a time in Europe And I think Corona, even if it didn't play the most important role in the elections, and I agree with that, maybe if it would be 2 months earlier, you see how volatile public opinion can be, because there are very narrow differences even between the Christian Democrats and the SPD. But they have shown the fault lines in society. If I look to some of the other items that were important in Germany, it's also inequality. You might not think that, because it's relatively a very rich and equal country with low unemployment levels. But nevertheless, if I look to some of the figures, for instance, of 15%, I think, of the lower classes in Germany who have gone through the changes in the beginning of this millennium, that you see actually when it comes to education, only 15 or 20% make it beyond a bachelor degree. So education reform, emancipation is also, I think, a key issue which should be mentioned here. Now, you ask me in the rest of Europe, this is a very complex issue, because if I look, the young voters in Germany looked to green, to digitalization, but also to housing and education for the reasons I just mentioned. You see now that in, for instance, France, where we will have elections next year, you see that the sort of the prioritization of those items is very different. First, it's employment and the economy. Second, it's migration. And third, it's crime. So it's a very different set of priorities in terms of at least the items on the basis of which people are going to select. And you see that also reflected in the French debate at the moment. They also want change, but they're in a different, you would say, a different political economy, a different political situation right now. You see a new far-right politician coming up in France. I won't go into it because we're talking about Germany today. But definitely, even if Macron is still leading the polls, we will see a much more complex tableau there. And the same goes for the country you mentioned, is Italy, which has now a very stable government under Prime Minister Draghi, but at the same time also has, it was a large coalition, by the way, which is really working on Italian stability, on economic modernization, on legal modernization in the country. It's at the same time the country which also has a very strong populist surge. And that was amazing. I think both of the colleagues mentioned that. The extremes did not win in Germany. In that sense, it was kind of experimental, if you wish. It's not the extreme right or the extreme left that won. Not at all. Even the Linke, I think, comes back with a few seats, but they didn't make the 5%. And on the right side, except for two important states, and so that should not be forgotten, you see nevertheless that, you know, this is not a fragmentation. It's not the Netherlands, but it is, as you just mentioned, an issue in which I am actually, and that I should say as a Dutchman, we have a disastrous process in this country at the moment regarding government formation. And I say that as somebody who has been in politics for many years in this country. For me, it's very interesting how very quickly, actually, the first important step has been taken today by these three coalition partners to make, as if they are sort of the logic team now to make that change. And we'll see if it really is going to work or not.
Thanks so much. I think that gave us a great overview of the elections and sort of what that means in terms of the actual elections. I now want to discuss a little bit more. We've hinted at what it means for foreign and security policy, and even though Professor Koops already mentioned it wasn't high on the agenda during the elections, but since it's in the name of the event, I think we should discuss what it means. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but before that, for the online audience, just as a reminder, you can ask questions on world.joinlive.tv is the link for asking questions. So, German change and security and foreign policy. Perhaps can we start with Ambassador Brengelmann? Could you reflect a little bit on what this change in government means for the institutions that Germany is a member of, so the EU, NATO, and what you think might happen in terms of foreign policy or security policy now that we have somewhat of an idea of who the new chancellor might be and what the coalition might be?
Yeah, thank you. And will also be important to see not just who's the new chancellor, but who will be foreign minister, or even perhaps sometimes more important, finance minister. And that is, as you can imagine, very much still an open issue. I think in general it's fair to say that there will not really be a major break. Also, this new incoming government will be very much pro-European Union and also pro-NATO, but there will be nuances between them. So the coalition negotiations, the formal negotiations, which are now only to start, will have to deal more with foreign policy than we might have expected before. Because in the shadows, there are some possible differences. I think when you look at what they have published today, you see that the Liberals were quite successful when it comes to further debts to invest. They will make the necessary investments, but within the debt ceilings. And they didn't increase, or they say they will not increase the usual taxes, but they will work it the other way. So that will be an important feature also for the European debate, and I think we haven't seen the details of that yet. When it comes to foreign and security policy and NATO, there are, as I indicated, nuances. I think it's fair to say that the CDU was very much more pro for the 2% of NATO's budget, this goal of 2% of gross national product for NATO's budget. That was clearly CDU. The other parties have much more doubt about that in general. When it comes to military interventions outside the treaty area, I would imagine that also the new government will find it a little bit more difficult to come to agreements there. Also, all three of them are rather more on the skeptical side. But still, when it comes to details, they might find it more difficult to agree. And the first decision to come in that field will be the EU missions in Mali. So that will be interesting to see. I think the most important aspect, however, of what this new government might mean will be on our relationship, Europe, vis-à-vis Russia and China. And how will we relate as Europe to what our American allies ask us to do? And very clearly, the Liberals and the Greens, I take Russia as an example, are very much pro respect for human rights, rule of law, and all of that. The SPD is in general also in favor of that, but they are more open when it comes to dealing and dialoguing with Russia. And you could see that on that one issue, Nord Stream 2, where the SPD was very much in favor of Nord Stream 2, and the Greens very much not in favor of Nord Stream 2. So there you could see in the past that there were clearly differences. And let me indicate two other things which we might perhaps touch later, but I will just mention them. There will have to be a decision in the German security policy debate about what we call nukleare Teilhabe. That means that some planes should be ready to carry American nuclear weapons. And these planes have to be changed, modernized. And there is clearly a difference. The Greens, for example, are clearly not in favor of that. So it will be interesting to see how they will relate to that issue when it comes to decision time. And there's also a very heated debate in Germany about the use of drones in military interventions, with the SPD being very much in doubt about that, the Liberals more in favor. And also this is one issue which we haven't seen in the paper which was published today on foreign and security policy. The paper of today was rather more general on some other issues like taxes and climate, etc. They already now were coming out with very clear ideas. When it comes to foreign and security policy, it's rather more vague at this moment. When it comes to Europe, let me only add one thing which will perhaps be an issue. Climate will also dominate the European debate. And I think we can all agree on the importance of more renewables, etc., etc. When it comes to nuclear power, I think there's clearly a difference between, for example, Germany and France on that issue. When I have been asked what is the major difference between Germany and France in the past, I would always say it's described by one word, which is nuclear. And that relates to nuclear power, but also to nuclear weapons. Germany has very different background, history, even you could even argue emotions about these issues than our French partners. And that could be also an issue in the European debate. Let me stop there. There are many others, but I think I would see them as the most important ones.
Great. Thanks so much, Ambassador. Professor Koops, would you perhaps like to add anything to that and maybe also talk a little bit about what a change in government might mean for European collective defense and strategic sovereignty? And in your answer, maybe briefly explain for the students in the room what that means.
Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. Maybe just some kind of additions to what Ambassador Brengelmann already outlined. So I think if you look at the longue durée, at the history of German foreign and security policy, it is really marked by continuity rather than change. And the fact that you have the SPD in all likelihood in the government will also mean continuity on a variety of things. What are the key cornerstones of Germany's foreign policy? Multilateralism and the importance of the UN system, a commitment to NATO and European integration, and a so-called civilian power approach. So the idea that diplomacy and economic links are at least as important, if not more important, than the use of military force. So a general resistance still to use the military for reaching foreign policy goals. This norm has changed, of course, during the last 2 decades. Germany has become reluctantly more involved in UN peacekeeping missions. The ambassador mentioned Mali, but of course also the biggest, just like the Netherlands, the biggest cultural shift came as a result of Germany's involvement in ISAF and in resolute support in Afghanistan. The debate on the failures and also successes, we also should look at that, of Germany's involvement in Afghanistan has essentially been parked. There have been some debates right now initiated by the outgoing Minister of Defense, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, but it was also mentioned, by the way, as a footnote, she tried to initiate a lessons learned conference with parliamentarians. All parliamentarians and the Minister of Foreign Affairs did not attend this conference, despite being invited, because they essentially said this is something for the new government to look at and not for the old. There's a split of opinion in the military itself. They would have liked to have the current government that was responsible for the withdrawal to also immediately look at the lessons from Afghanistan and the withdrawal. But of course, these international engagements in coalitions, peacekeeping or stabilization missions have had an influence on Germany's attitude, but not fundamentally. So there's mostly only a contribution from Germany if other allies are involved. In Mali, it was the Netherlands and France that were, let's say, sometimes more than gently prodding Germany to get involved. And of course, in Afghanistan, it was in particular the involvement of the US. So there will not be, I think, a massive change in that element of German foreign security policy. Where there will be some interesting elements to watch, and indeed Ambassador Brengelmann already mentioned the policy towards Russia, where the SPD also traditionally, it was the architect of Ostpolitik, so the Eastern policies of détente and cooperation in the 70s, that still is in the kind of party gene of foreign policy towards Russia. It's more about dialogue and engagement rather than strict and strong sanctions. Completely different when you look at the foreign policy program of the Liberals and the Greens. Very strong words there on human rights, on civil rights also. The Liberals, traditionally the party also for civil rights of the LGBT community, also of course criticizing Russia for laws that curb the civil rights of these groups of society, and a much stricter and stronger emphasis on sanctions and a strong stance on Russia. China, interestingly, in the Green official party, the Greens call China a competitor, partner, and systemic rival. So the systemic rival, I think that's something quite new in a party program of a German party when it comes to the relationship with China and the balance between the necessity to engage but also strict foreign policy when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to geopolitical ambition. So there really the Liberals and the Greens go further than the SPD, which is more based on moderation and dialogue. Also interesting, maybe for those of you interested in gender and foreign policies, the Greens are the only party that puts in their program that in the future, in all negotiation teams, they want to have parity of gender. So as many female negotiators as men, and that in itself should mainstream then also a feminist foreign policy perspective next to a climate change diplomacy. So every single issue of foreign policy should also be related to the impact on climate. So of course these are different emphases depending on the party's core base and core emphasis that also move into foreign policy domains. Questions about European integration, now strategic autonomy in general. The Liberals and the Greens are in favor of deeper European integration. The Liberals are traditionally quite strict when it comes to financial integration, finance markets, and for example the debt crisis. It was the Liberals that really put a brake on Germany agreeing to financial solidarity, let's call it this, but also the communalization of debt. They were quite strict on that. The Greens emphasize more solidarity for European integration, and the SPD somewhere in between. Now, strategic autonomy is of course the entire debate now taking place in Brussels. Bert, you just came from Brussels. I'm sure that's also high on the agenda there, which is as a result of the demands of security policy in the EU and its neighborhood, and let's say a sense of not lack of reliability, but a sense of distance between Europe and the US, the European Union really has to develop, and European members have to develop their own capacities for launching military and security policies and defense. That's not new, and that's nothing to do per se with the new government that we can expect in Germany. We have had this discussion at least since the 60s, but it's re-emerging every decade with a new case. This time it's of course also Afghanistan, but also the Trump administration left, I think, quite a shadow here. And that's also interesting where I think the Liberals and the Greens in their section on transatlantic relations, they talk about NATO and the US being important partner, but in the same paragraph they will both mention, but strategic autonomy of Europe is a key priority and needs to be advanced. Now, all eyes on Germany is probably something that will be disappointed expectations, because also here, in terms of the expectations towards Germany as a leader in security and defense in Europe, often are not matched by the actual action then that Germany takes. So something to be watched. It could well be that as a result of a more activist, liberal and green section in the foreign policy that more advances could be made. But yeah, you rightly said already, there are also huge differences when it comes to the use of different weapon systems, when it comes to agreement to a more interventionist foreign policy, and so on and so forth. Strategic autonomy, there was second.
Yeah, I think you touched on it.
I'll leave it
yes,
for a moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Koops. Professor Koenders, would you like to add anything to that? And perhaps we can also shift the focus a little bit more to the economy. Germany is an economic powerhouse, as you already mentioned. They have all the money. What do you see in terms of change and continuity economically for Europe and the world?
Thank you very much for that excellent question. Look, I don't have anything to add on the points that were just excellently made by Professor Koops. I think, you know, let's talk a little bit about where the new German government will have to deal with, because this has been I don't have anything to add to this. As you know, internal cohesion and the relationship between these three parties will be key in terms of how they can externally have a certain leadership position, and it will also determine the expectation levels of others. And I agree, I think there's one mistake is to think that, you know, there is only one leader in Germany, 80 million people, the largest economy, and whatever is expected from the new need for leadership in Europe, it can only come from Germany. That's irrealistic in a country, in a European Union of 27, and will very much be determined also by the relationship with France. And there's so much to be said about it, which I won't do right now. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. I think there's two things there. Maybe the economy in Europe, and for this country this is absolutely key. As you know, Germany for us is by far the most important economic actor, both in terms of technology, exports, imports, investments. But most important is also is there a leadership of Germany in the European Union on issues that are so sensitive in Europe, including corona bonds, in terms of making the climate deal work, making also Europe a sort of an investment. And this is also part of the changes you see in Europe. We're going to investment states. You see that debate in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands. The role of the state has become larger in the last couple of years due to corona and due to the economic situation. And that plays itself out now also, I think, in Germany. Now, one is on, I think, the European economy. It will be likely that the SPD is leading, the Bundeskanzler will be from the SPD. Let's assume that for a second, that we have Mr. Scholz, who is the former and at present Minister of Finance. And I think he has worked pretty well with the French minister in that tension that these two have about the future of the euro, about transfer union, about corona bonds, about the whole issue how you do actually in this time work on the European economy. And we don't know exactly what comes out of this, but to me it's very clear that one of the debates will be, and Macron will definitely try to put this forward, this idea of not so much common debt, it's actually a debt of the European Commission, of the European institutions. It was very smartly done. And I think the Chancellor Merkel has very much said when this happened, these were symmetric threats in Europe. It was all because of the pandemic that we could do that, so it's not a precedent. And Macron will see this differently. So we will have to see how Scholz is going to deal with this in the context of his cooperation with the Greens and the FDP. But that role of Europe in terms of a budget, the investment, the illogical situation we have right now in which the central bank actually takes so far a very political position by printing money and money and money. And now after the corona crisis, also a fiscal side coming on it, that will be the major challenge to look at Germany. Don't forget, for all of you who don't use this debate or follow this in terms of technical economic issues, the way one looks at Germany, especially in Italy and in southern countries, including from this country, is very, very, very sensitive. It's one of the key issues. And the way that will be played out, we will have to say. The second is on the external, sort of the engine. To be very honest, I don't know, maybe the colleagues don't agree with this, but the strength of the German economy is built on a cheap euro, on relatively cheap labor compared to other countries because of the Hertz changes, and of an enormous export capacity in Europe, but also towards China. Now, within Europe, I'm pretty convinced actually that Chancellor Merkel has seen this enormous importance of the European economy and its growth and its modernization as crucial for the German economy. And therefore, I think what happened since Brexit and since the election of Trump, and I saw that in Chancellor Merkel, basically she has put forward it is a European responsibility also on the economic field, and not only in the strategic foreign policy field to think through what it means for us. In terms of that relationship between solidarity in Europe and responsibility of each individual country, that balance has changed somewhat. What that will mean in the future, we don't know yet. On the relationship with China, it's much more complex. If we would assume a green foreign minister, which is likely but not sure, I'm sure, that depends on all kind of internal fights there will be a tougher relationship with China. And it is clear that, I think the Chancellor's just been in China to say goodbye to President Xi. She was, of course, one who said, in the end, we have to deal with China. It's 1.2 billion people. Yes, we have to talk about human rights. Yes, we have to talk about the Uyghurs, but we are also, it's a big export market. It's not even that big as sometimes it's thought, but it's important. So where do we strike a deal? Do we want a China that is contained economically and where we have geopolitically a problem with China for all the reasons we know, militarily, human rights, authoritarian, and at the same time we are more interdependent with China than ever? So the big question for the German economy will be, how will it deal with globalization? How will it deal with different supply chains? How will it deal then with a China in which I guess Germany and the Netherlands don't want to be confronted with sort of a new Cold War with China, but that sort of the way that mix will be is still unclear. My last point is on Russia. Also on the economy. We look today, because of course party platforms are great and so are government. I didn't see it yet, but I know it from my own past being a minister for 6 years. On foreign policy, it's the least credible part of your government agreement, because the world is not only in terms of tectonic shifts changing, with a larger responsibility for Europe, with a geostrategic sense of alienation that you find also in Germany, who is actually with us. Maybe Trump comes back in 2024. Maybe China remains an important rival. It will remain in any case. And we have this world around us which is strategically at least complex, including in our neighborhood. Then what do we do with the relationship with Russia? I think that is, especially in Germany, it's a very different debate than in this country. I think there's much more different debates within in the SPD. The Greens are tougher. But you see what happens now. These things are intertwined. It's about geo-economy. The energy prices, the spot market prices are higher than ever. Why is that? Because what we have to do in Europe and in Germany is make this transition, not a transition to gas. That's what happened in Germany. Went from coal to gas and out of nuclear. And so in the meantime, you're now, in this event, you have to deal with a spot market in which the Russians have a great advantage. There is an issue I think that's is going to be absolutely key. And I am very positive about, I haven't seen yet the paper yet that you have seen at 1 o'clock. But the only way to deal with that, and you want to reduce the dependency of this, is going on with making alternative energy sources cheaper, invest in it better, make sure that in the end that dependency is reduced. And I leave Nord Stream for what it is. It's now already built and it's almost ready. But in my sense, the German government, and my own government, by the way, also made a mistake there, because they only looked at it from a strictly economic point of view, but not from a geostrategic point of view. And we're paying a little bit of price for that right now. It's a bit more complex than that. But I would suggest also here, I don't like the word strategic autonomy. It's about, getting more sovereignty about your own economy and your security, and trying to build on that within Europe. I think this will be one of the major issues that the German government will be faced with, because you will have a difference maybe between the Greens and the Liberals and even the SPD on how you deal in this case with the events right now with the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Thanks. We've covered a lot of topics, a lot of difficult questions for a potential new government in Germany. I would suggest that we now open up to the floor for questions. Are there any questions for our expert panel in the room? Up there. A microphone is coming.
Can I hold it, or you're gonna? I'm going to hold it. Okay, yeah. Sorry for the workout for coming up. Thanks so much for being here. I just have sort of one quick question about strategic autonomy and sort of more Europeanization of defense policy and security policy. We already see a lot of uneasiness about Europe-level monetary policy with endless lawsuits about, the legal points are maybe a bit technical, but usurpation of democratic sovereignty in Germany in terms of sort of loss of democratic control on monetary policy was the essence of the lawsuit, as I understand it. Do you see a risk as sort of Europe plays a bigger role, and maybe the Bundesrepublik plays a smaller role in deciding German military policy or defense policy, that there could be legal issues, and especially given that very famously a German president had to resign over his comments over why German soldiers are deployed abroad?
Is there anyone who would like to take that question first, Ambassador?
Yeah, thank you. I must say, my whole diplomatic life, I've been in that debate, how much transatlantic, how much European, and then there was a crisis with the United States, and there was a crisis with France. So, although it all seems very new, that debate has been with us all the time. It has now become a little bit more topical again, because quite rightly, the Europeans noticed that, for example, during the Libya operation, that the US were very reluctant to get engaged. So in the end, it was NATO, and the US put in their weight, but they did so only after some reluctance. The French and the British were pushing, and the Americans came in only a little bit later. A big jump, recent situation in Afghanistan, the airport, the famous story, all of us were dependent on the Americans being there to keep the airport open. It was a NATO operation, so the debate on why couldn't the Europeans do it was a little bit unfair, because it was not a European operation, but it clearly showed to the Europeans how dependent they are. So in a nutshell, we will need to find a kind of middle way through our dependence, which we still have on the US, and more strategic autonomy for the Europeans, whilst at the same time not giving up this alliance, because this alliance has been the bedrock of our security for decades. And mind you, even in the European Union, there are a lot of countries, a lot of partners and allies who rely a lot on the US and who have misgivings about more European autonomy. So we need to find the good formula for that. I think usually Germany has been in the middle of that debate. Lately, I think we have been a little bit more in favor also of more European autonomy. I think there was a development on that in Germany, and I've also seen a development on that issue here in the Netherlands. Let me just reflect on one thing which Professor Koops has also touched, and that is the role of Germany within the European Union and other international organs in terms of, some would call it, to lead. Germany and its citizen has still, call it a historic reflex, or call it a more, so to say, idealistic approach, but many Germans still have a lot of misgivings when it comes to more military engagement. This is not because, so to say, we shy away, but because we have a history, because we were having politicians saying, nie wieder Krieg, and that was very much part of the German soul for many decades. And I can tell you, when I came home, being a NATO official, discussing issues in my local pub, the pub test, so to say, I could find out that many people were saying, oh, we should be careful, let's not overdo it, etc., etc. I think we also need to be very careful. I remember, I think it was 2014, the Munich Security Conference, where the president, the foreign minister, the defense minister, etc., all of them said Germany needs to play a more active role. It takes some time, it is happening, but it takes some time. And Chancellor Merkel, you might have noticed, when she was asked whether Germany was ready to lead, she would never use the term lead. She would only say Germany knows its responsibility. To say we lead, even Germans wouldn't like her to say it. This is still a process which would need time, and don't break the China where, so to say, when you push Germans to be leading. It's not yet, so to say, in the DNA. I think that's all I would like to say on that.
Thanks. Professor Kunders or Professor Koops, would you like to add anything to that?
Just very briefly, I mean, your question also, part of it was whether there is misgivings in Germany about, too much competence at the EU level on security and defense. As a as a convicted, convinced and convicted European, convinced rather, not yet convicted, convinced European, I would be glad if that was the case. But this is not going to happen. It's strongly intergovernmental. Member states are really in the lead when it comes to deciding on military missions, when it comes on any progress in terms of a common approach to security and defense. This is really firmly in the corner of intergovernmentalism and really small steps. Lots of interesting things are happening at multilateral or minilateral levels, so deeper integration between some member states. Also, I mean, the Germany and the Netherlands, a very good example. Really deep integration between the armed forces in the last 10 decades. Joint corps, for example, Dutch-German corps in Münster, but also strong integration of the Dutch tank divisions into German command even, and vice versa, naval integration. So there's a lot of stuff going on below in terms of deeper cooperation, but it's always on agreements between 3 or 4 more states rather than really at the EU level. So and probably it's going to stay like that for some years to come.
Thanks. We have a question online now, which relates back to the Russia-Germany relation. We touched on it a little bit already, but this question asked, I would like to relate to the political and economic relations with Russia. Do you think that with the new government in power, Germany's policy towards Russia will shift and become less lenient than it was, especially during the invasion of Ukraine or Navalny's apprehension? Is there anyone who would like to take the lead on the Russia-Germany question, Ambassador?
There was a look to the middle, huh? That's political. Yes, I think the Greens will make a very strong push there for more human rights and rule of law oriented foreign policy. The SPD, as Professor Koops already said, by tradition is more open to dialogue and business with Russia, so that may create tensions within the future government to come. Let me add, however, on this, in terms of the question, Navalny, there I wouldn't say that Germany was lenient, because it was actually Germany who got Navalny out of Russia and to the Berlin Charité hospital, and Chancellor Merkel went to see him in the hospital. So I don't think that Germany was particularly lenient on that issue. But yes, it might become a point of discussion in the future government. I expect some more rule of law spice in the policy mix.
Any other questions in the room? Yes, I see one over here on to my left and up there. Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how would you evaluate the future of the CDU, especially if they're actually going into opposition?
The future of the CDU.
Yeah, very interesting question. So I think at the moment, if you follow German media reports, it can be said rather safely that the CDU is in disarray, both in terms of leadership, contestation. It's pretty clear that the days of Armin Laschet are numbered. The only way he could still cling on to party leadership was by leaving open the possibility that maybe the negotiations between the SPD, Liberals and Greens fail, and then the Liberals and Greens will turn to the CDU for a so-called Jamaica coalition, nothing to do with the country, but simply the colors. In Germany, there's this tradition that you always make up certain images related to the colors of the parties. So traffic light coalition now, red, green, yellow, and with a black, green, yellow, it would be a Jamaica coalition. National flag of Jamaica. So that was the kind of holding out for that. That's very unlikely now, which means, and the knives have come out already, there's a lot of kind of halfway discussions about leadership, follow-on leadership discussions. And there is a huge discussion on how to organize it. So some members of the party say, well, it should be chosen by the senior by party convention or by the senior party committees, and then there is from the bottom up, from the base, really the baseline, regional organizations, committees, a demand to have a really open discussion all the way down to the local levels on who the next party leader should be. So that's an important aspect, because we saw personalities also mattered, but also party politics mattered. And it will be interesting to see how the CDU now, in opposition, will position itself. It has to really come up with particular strong alternatives now towards this government, new government that really, gets this push on being a government of renewal and tackling key issues. Of how you want to position yourself against it. You don't want to be too close to the remaining opposition party, that is the AfD, the far-right party, which will certainly move with a lot of populist sentiments that are also maybe more on the right spectrum that the CDU and CSU maybe are on some of the issues competing on. So you want to stay distant from that. But on the other hand, you have to have some kind of profile to really make points against the new government. So I think it would be very, very difficult. I also think what we've seen with the SPD during the last 15 years will, to a certain extent, continue with the CDU. There's a clear split of the voting of the electorate between the far right and the CDU, just as it happened with the SPD and the far left. If there's not a strong new leader emerging and a very strong opposition program, I think the next election we will see even a further historic low in terms of the election results.
Professor Gunders,
No,
would
I
you like
didn't
to
want
add
to say
something?
anything about the CDU. I think the colleagues know that much better, and I think it's very logical what Professor Koops is saying. I just wanted to come back on the question that was raised about the role of Germany and Russia and the US. Of course, we're talking today about the logic of a certain consensus in German foreign policy and the different positions of SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, and that will be key. Obviously, internal coherence, your internal views will determine what you can do outside in terms of leadership. And how much carry you want, what is the carrying weight of that coalition in whatever level of leadership that the German government wants to take in Europe. I'm not talking about now the expectation levels of other countries or how big it should be, but it's important to note. Second, it doesn't mean that I don't think that we have to realize that there are two things that we have to take into account. One is the principled insecurity of the world we're in right now. I was just talking about the relationship with Russia, where we can have all kinds of ideas, but if we don't have our geoeconomics in our climate policy in hands, we don't think about it, we can say whatever we like in terms of human rights or about economic relationship, but before you know it, the reality is a different one. And I think when I sense the mood of the country in Germany, and the colleagues here know much better, is that there is at least an urge, and I hope that is going to lead to something in which a bit more of a strategic position is taken by the German government on this. And I was impressed, and I think what happened, and I might be wrong, but if I look to Chancellor Merkel in the last 3 or 4 years, I see it in my own government when I was foreign minister, and we were dealing a lot with the German government. I think Brexit and the election of Trump have really led the Chancellor, taking all pragmatism aside, which he is good at, and you have to be pragmatic in a world of events. And you have to build consensus in Europe, and I hope somebody else will have the authority to keep making those deals. But nevertheless, there is the issue that she saw of a geostrategic issue for Europe, which is much bigger than before. It is not completely unlikely we have a new American president in 2 years who will look at NATO like President Trump did. When you talk about the whole issue about the relationship with China, which we discussed, is there a position of Europe in this? And it's for Germany not easy because, you were almost taken, a few very key companies were taken over were likely to be taken over by the Chinese, and the German government said correctly, hey, we have to think not only in terms of sort of free trade and investment, there has to be reciprocity and there has to be strategy behind it. So I would hope also that in the context of the geostrategic position of Europe, this new government will have a strategy that goes beyond events. And I have no illusions in that in one way or the other. We will have to see. But my sense from German policy in the last couple of years under the leadership of the present Chancellor, who obviously had a lot of experience, and she's worked through, she has made this shift in her head. And then it's up how you work about it. And on the military point, let me just say this, and I'm saying this, we do this together, and I'm from a left-wing party. We are not the first one who say defense expenditures have to go up, but Germany and the Netherlands are below the European Union average. The strategic culture in Germany is developing, but it's not very high. I've very much exchanged with the German government when I was foreign minister on Mali. We both had similar issues. What do you do when you really take responsibility? It will be very vital also who will become the Minister of Defense. And if that person is going to make something about the Ministry of Defense and how it will function, and how it will look at, I don't care, European pillar of NATO, Security Council, European autonomy, you can endlessly discuss this. But it's absolutely key to me that if Europe wants to remain, wants to have a narrative, you can only have a narrative in Europe on human rights, on principles, if you also have the geopolitical clout to back it up. I'm not saying military means. We're not going to fight for human rights. I'm the last one to say as a big opponent of the Iraq war. Don't understand me wrong. But this strategic sense of what we have to do with Europe, I would hope that some of the governments that are sometimes not very proactive on that, including the one in my own country, are thinking through how they could make a pragmatic deal in Europe on that. And there Germany is key, because it is the biggest country, it has the biggest economy, it will have to work with France, but also with the other countries. So I just wanted to say that is also an important point, which I hope very much that a new government in Germany can closely work with us.
Thank you. Ambassador Brengelmann, want to add something before we move to our next question?
Yeah, I would say only two additions to the CDU, but before getting there, Bert is prompting me to add something here, because I would agree with all you have said, and I think that those who will take responsibility in the new government think alike. And don't forget that Scholz has been finance minister during the last Merkel years, and when this European action had to be taken, which was then leading to the Merkel-Macron proposal in the European Union, it was very much Scholz who was also backing it up. So I think he has the clout and the experience there, and then let's see who's doing the foreign ministry and defense. But I believe that for our more geopolitical stance as Europe, we need also internal coherence, so to say, within the European Union. And I mean that in two aspects. Let me take China for a change and not Russia. When Lithuania took a particular stance on China and Taiwan, the Chinese were hitting very hard. So I think here it's very important for the Europeans to always keep solidarity between themselves. But it also works the other way around. I think it is very difficult for Europe to be able to accept that one country, and most people would know whom I'm talking about, was using veto power in European foreign policy when it comes to China, because they had good economic relations in particular with China. So we need that internal coherence and solidarity at the same time. Otherwise, we will not be able to act as Europeans. On the CDU, only two things. There will be a lot of things happening in the next weeks. One issue also is the change in terms of generation. And two ministers, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and Altmaier, gave up their seats in the Bundestag before the new Bundestag even came in place, because they said they want to give their seat to members of the younger generation. So that was a clear move. Let's see what the reaction in other Bundesländer will be. They are both from the Saarland area, so it was a regional thing. And that is the other point, regional issues. When you look at the recent power struggle within the CDU, it were only men from North Rhine-Westphalia. So all the candidates which were in the race were men from North Rhine-Westphalia. So in other states, people are slowly but surely taking up that issue. do we really want that, so to say, power center only in North Rhine-Westphalia? The CDU is for the whole of Germany. So we need more regional balance here. Some others will come out and say, only men? We have had a female chancellor, so why should there be no role for women now? So you will see these two issues to play a stronger role when it comes to the issue of what should be the future orientation of the CDU. Thank you.
Next question.
Yes, so actually I wanted to return to Russia and Nord Stream 2, but less actually about Russia, but more about the EU internally. Because on the one hand, obviously you said Nord Stream 2 is coming, and I wanted to ask how will this affect also the relationship between Germany and Eastern and Central European countries, as they've lobbied quite harshly against it, and they lost. So if that will have any lasting repercussions on the relationship, while kind of intertwined with the new coalition probably being more harsher on Russia, will this actually help also European cohesion when Germany goes more into the direction of other Central and Eastern European countries to be more anti-Russia, and kind of bridge again the gap between the West and the East of the EU, or if that doesn't really help? What's your opinion?
Professor Koops, would you like to tackle that one?
Start and then pass on the microphone. Very interesting question, and I think just like towards the West, so NATO and the US, also towards the East, I think Germany has traditionally tried to play a kind of balancing role, to really be in the middle of mediating between those that really want to see a tougher stance on Russia, and that is Central Eastern Europe, of course, particularly Poland, but also the Baltic states. So to reassure and to make sure that these bilateral relationship with Poland, all domestic issues notwithstanding of the current government in Poland, where there are lots of disagreements, obviously, at the EU level, but also at the German level, is still historically strong a relationship and also imbued with historic responsibility. That's very clear. So any kind of foreign policy pressures and issues, Germany normally tries to take Poland's strategic interests into consideration. But Nord Stream, of course, was the dividing issue where precisely that kind of tradition was tested, where for the Central Eastern states, it was really seen as an abandonment of German responsibility towards that region and a cozying up to Russia. So it will be interesting to see, again, how the influence of the Greens and the Liberals will play out. And it depends, of course, who will have the foreign ministry. That's still not clear. It's interesting. You mentioned it earlier as a footnote. Normally, so the deputy chancellor in Germany is normally traditionally always the foreign minister, indicating that the foreign ministry is the second most important resort in the government. That has shifted completely, as you rightly hinted at. Not only in Germany, in politics in general in Europe. Finance ministry, as a result also of 2008, is really the prize now, and you can also see that both the leaders of the Green and of the Liberals, they're both vying now for who's going to become the finance minister. As a footnote. So how this will play out in Europe depends indeed exactly on whether there's a shift. I would expect, particularly pushed for by the Liberals and the Greens, a stronger alignment, certainly in rhetoric, whether that follows through with action, but certainly in rhetoric, to support the strategic interests of the Central Eastern European neighbors and make a stronger policy on Russia. As a last point, the vacuum at the European strategic level of Britain's departure has not been filled, I think. It was the UK that was traditionally very, very strong. It was the initiator of most sanctions against Russia, in fact, in the European Council. And that's the question also, how that will be filled with an equally active major power in that sense.
No? Are there more questions? Yes, I see quite a few. We have time for one more question. I see a hand up there. Two more, yeah.
What is Germany's overall position in the broken French submarine deal and France's general initiative for militarization?
Anyone who would like to take the lead?
So, it was interesting to see, and of course, the entire attention was again on the election. So also a lot of statements were mostly made on domestic politics that the German government kept pretty out and pretty quiet about that implication. There was not a particularly strong stance either way. Also, it would not be advisable at this stage now, because it would really you would have to make a clear choice between siding with the US and, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon alliance and or siding with France. So to my understanding, it was deliberately not featured in a high-profile way, also to avoid having to make a public statement on this. The only speeches and statements that were made were again on the importance of European integration, the importance, of course, with the partnership with the French, and the importance also of NATO, but not as prolific as it could have been.
In general, yes, but I think there was a clear feeling that this issue came right after we have seen the situation in Afghanistan. So it did create with some German quarters that feeling or that question, can we still rely on an ally who was actually saying, Biden was saying, the US is back and we will talk to our allies. And then we have seen what happened in Afghanistan, that didn't talk much to their allies. And on top of that, we have had this situation with that particular deal. So I think there was some doubt there about it, and there was in the back of people's minds some sympathy for the French situation. And then it did happen. I think that also played a role in the midst of a vacuum. We are right now searching for a government. Merkel is still there. There's no new chancellor yet. So who's really speaking for Germany these days? But the feeling was that what the US have done was not very helpful. Let me put it at least like this.
Okay, that's it was definitely not helpful. Look, I understand what you're saying. I think this specific deal on, with Australia, first of all, I think the French government in itself was completely correct. If you are transatlantic partners, you discuss this, you negotiated. It's about a major strategic issue of the future of, what kind of commitment you want to make in that region, and therefore the lack of any serious discussion is bad. I'm not so sure the French played this very well, to be very honest with you. I think that's also one of the reasons that maybe they didn't get the support that maybe they should have had. But it's not the key question. I mean, I think we should have maybe been a bit more solidaristic with Macron, although we know that this has a lot to do also with the way the French dealt with their weapons exports strategies and things that they keep secret and prices and so on. It's all a bit more complex than it is. It's not only a strategic question. But it shows a little bit that we have to get further in thinking through what our China strategy is. I think that is absolutely key. You see now, for instance, that some countries are actually part of this naval visit to the Chinese Sea. And actually the German government is docking, I think, its ship in Shanghai, while the others don't. No. That's very interesting.
No, they are not.
No, they did. No. They did. Yes, they did.
No, they were disinvited. No.
Yeah, they were disinvited, but they wanted to go. That's the thing.
They were disinvited.
No, but the issue is not that they didn't go there, that they wanted to go there. That's true. So here you have, and then of course they're disinvited. It's the best thing the Chinese could do. So you play a game with the Europeans. And we've had that constantly the case. You mentioned it on Lithuania. And I think Germany is vulnerable here. It has to clarify its position, to be very honest, on these kind of things. But it's not so much in this case of Macron, because frankly, I think he was right, but nevertheless there's much more to be said about it. But this issue, do we want in the future of NATO, the future of Europe, do we want to focus on our region? Do we still want to work with the Americans in the South China Sea? If so, to what level? Where would be our priorities? That question cannot be avoided anymore. And I think that is a bit of the background of this event, which is not necessarily the most important one, I guess.
All right, we had a few more questions in the audience. I see, yeah, over there, that was the first hand, right by the pillar. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. All right, perfect.
Okay, although this would have been a nice wrap-up or eventual comment, if it's a comment to be asked. Simply, the ambassador mentioned earlier, rightfully, that Germans are obviously shying away from using the word leadership. But from my part of the world, I come from Southeastern Europe, from North Macedonia. I'm a diplomat on leave now. We remember some times when Germany was very active. Not that Germany was not active under Madame Merkel, but maybe her character was more reserved and more definitely pragmatic. But let's say in a similar context, political, domestic in Germany in the late 90s, where we had an SPD prime minister, Mr. Schröder, and we had a foreign minister of the Greens, Mr. Fischer, Joschka Fischer, who was a very leftish kind of a green person before. Eventually we got a very active German policy in the Balkans, militarily even, only 10 years after reunification, and very much politically. Even before that with Mr. Genscher before that, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. So I wonder, of course, it's 20 years later, but still we might have a green foreign minister, SPD in charge in the prime ministry, to have a similar, a surprising moment of Germany being even more visibly active than it was under Madame Merkel in the previous years.
We'll take a second question and then combine the answers.
Yes, this question is more for the two Germans in the panel, sorry. Do you think the younger generations of the German people want Germany to fill the power vacuum left after the Brexit? Or do they still want to be reluctant like the older generations?
Thank you. Perhaps let's start with Ambassador Brengelmann, and you can tackle both or one of the questions and wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you mentioned you're a diplomat from Northern Macedonia, right? So we were also very active on that Berlin process, etc. So to be shying away from the world leadership doesn't mean that you can't be active. I think we have been active. But you were referring to Schröder and Fischer. Mind you, this situation with Kosovo happened just after elections, which had put Helmut Kohl out of power and Schröder and Fischer into power. But they were not yet in power when for the first time Clinton was speaking to those two whether or not Germany would join the Kosovo operation. So it was very spicy at that moment. Two people just having been voted into power needed to make what? Their first decision on military intervention right away. I remember it was quite a moment in German politics at that time. I wanted to come back only very briefly on that issue also we had before. I think you rightly said Germany needs to take a more clearer stance. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific, let me only give you one little footnote, which is that when it comes to the Indo-Pacific guidelines of the European Union, that cooperation was a threesome between Germany, France, and the Netherlands. So here you could see the three of us acting together, which was quite an interesting feature. And I must say, perhaps this is the last moment I keep the mic in my hand. Very grateful also for the former Foreign Minister Jaap Scheffer, professor here at Leiden, to come in on a Friday afternoon. Thank you, Jaap.
Thank you. Great. Professor Koops, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point you made about the fact that it was a very active government and it was against SPD and Greens. So that could be an interesting element also if the new government with the small parties want to really to be seen to make a difference, right? I think there was a lot of stability, a lot of center ground in foreign policy during the Grand Coalition, two Grand Coalitions in fact, and since 2005, and maybe that is a deliberate choice that will be made on being to be seen to take on more activist policies. On the future of the Brexit vacuum, it's very interesting that the former government, especially the former Minister of Defense, Ursula von der Leyen, before she became President of the Commission, she was heading the Ministry of Defense just at the time of the Brexit referendum. She came out a little bit out of the hiding and said, well, this is actually a great moment for European defense. This is actually now the time to move ahead with initiatives that normally the Brits put a damper and a brake on. And lots of people were quite skeptical because they also said, well, it's also the moment where those that have been hiding behind the British excuse in terms of not pushing European defense and security forward will be clear. And I think after 5 years of Brexit, not that much has really happened in terms of massive leaps, where we previously always said it's due to the Brits that we can't go further. So a lot of rhetoric in a sense, but it also means you have to, invest. You have to really forward initiatives in a bold way and not step by step, which I already said is normally not how it happens at the European level in that area. As I also mentioned, I do think there is still a gap in terms of a variety of geopolitical issues that the UK has been quite strong in advancing, I think also for the better of EU foreign policy.
You, Professor Koenders.
Yeah, let me just say on your comments, which I very much appreciate, and I'm glad you're here. And your country is one I've been very committed to in the past, and also in the time of the referendum and the campaign. Look, let me just applaud there the role of Germany. I think it's extremely important. I'm very worried about that region at the moment. Let's be honest. In your own country, there was a clear referendum on the name. There's a complete unclarity which at a high cost of many people in government and in opposition and in governing parties. And the result is not much in terms of even how it was followed up. I'm very worried about the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. If you look to the situation right now, what is happening, fortunately there is now a new high representative, which is important, but we will see what happens from that. From Austria, I think, isn't it? Serbia. Well, we can go in all this region. There has just been a summit of leaders on this region. But for me, it's very clear. I don't want to use the word leadership either. But without the Berlin process, this could have gone even much worse. And I'm worried about that. I think this is clearly in our neighborhood. And I know it's too simple to say it's either Turkey or Islamist fundamentalisms or the Russians who will take advantage of it. But there are elements of truth to this. This is our geostrategic region, and I think many in the peoples in the region of the Balkans, to be very honest with you, feel also that they are left by their own elites, and sometimes that the European Union is paying these off, and they don't see many results. That's an enormous problem I'm not going to solve in the last 5 minutes, but just to applaud how important I find not only what Chancellor Merkel has done in this, but also the German leadership in the Berlin process. And I hope that continues.
Thank you very much. On that note, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you again to our incredible panel, and especially to our distinguished guest, Ambassador Brengelmann. We have a small gift. And since there were still more questions in the audience, there is now also some time to ask questions over drinks and mingle. So please join us. And thank you very much for coming out on a Friday afternoon. Thank you.